As Ukrainians are taking up arms to defend their homeland, a new Quinnipiac poll asks, what would you do if you were in the same position as Ukrainians are right now? Would you stay and fight or leave the country? More than half of Democrats, 52%, say they would cut and run if America were invaded. Only 40% say that they would stick it out. This contrasts sharply with the 68% of Republicans who say they would stay to fight for the country. Mark Thiessen.
Well, even more disturbing than the partisan dynamic there is the generational dynamic. You're all too young to remember, but in 1984 there was a fantastic movie called Red Dawn. Red Dawn. It was a story of Wolverines, exactly. It was a story of a Soviet invasion of America, and these high school kids, led by Patrick Swayze and Charlie Sheen, form an insurgency to beat the Russians. Well, the Wolverines are no more. That poll shows that every generation except Gen X and millennials would stay and fight. 52% of those over 65 would stay and fight. God bless the silent generation and the boomers. 66% of those 50 to 64 would stay and fight. 57% of those 35 to 49 would fight, but only 45% of Gen X and Gen Z and millennials would stay and fight. 48% would flee. So Patrick Swayze's rolling over in his grave.
Just for 1 second, because I know you really drilled down on this more than anybody on the panel today, potentially. Are those people, though, with young children? I'm just trying to get a total demographic view of what the shift is there.
I don't know. It may have something to do with that, though. Most of the people in our military are in that 18 to 34-year-old demographic. Those are the people we'd actually be counting on. I'm sorry. I'm not going to be the one going to fight. Nobody wants me. Nobody wants someone over 65. It's that generation. But I think it might have something to do with this whole culture of safetyism. We've raised an entire generation of kids to be afraid to go walk outside after dark. So if you're walking outside after dark and there's like the Red Armies outside your door, you might be even more afraid.
Or if you live in some of these big blue-lead cities with the crime burgeoning.
Yes.
Like right now, they told us today that potentially a serial killer is on the loose here in New York and possibly with ties with the DC. You got to read about that to even believe it. So we're going to need toughness from our young people. Kennedy?
I would teach my kids to stay and fight. I would teach them about weapon safety. Absolutely. And it's not a surprise to me that people who believe in the Second Amendment would stay and defend their country. That's why we have a Second Amendment. So there is power among the people, God
Amen.
Forbid, come what may. And it's very interesting to see a lot of people on the left cheer those who are bearing arms to defend their own freedom in Ukraine, but they won't allow citizens in the United States the same luxury. But yes, in blue states, they have been trying to disarm the public, and I hope this gives a lot of people pause, because you want to be able to defend yourself, you want to be able to defend your family from the unknown, which is what we're seeing unfold right now.
Or with liberal policies with DAs, it's very much the known, because recidivism is on the rise, and it's violent. Emily?
Yes, and I see this as well as a demarcation between sort of that urban level of comfort living versus those people who understand what it's like to own property, to derive income and livelihood from that land, to know what it's like to have people want to come and take that land. That's a whole different chapter of history and a way of life in many parts of the country that someone who lives off of their laptop with food being delivered to their apartment door every night doesn't really understand, right? And that's, I think, exemplified with the Zers and millennials. No offense to you, Kaylee. But I contrast this such a stark contrast with those Ukrainians. First of all, 1 every second is leaving Ukraine and going into Poland. Yes. But what about we have vague numbers, but the almost 300,000 who have returned to their country to fight. And not only to fight, but we are learning of many who have returned to take care of elders, who are going to hospitals, who are taking care of those that have left behind. Exactly. I just read a story this morning of a woman and her elderly mother, and the elderly mother returned. Her name was Ira. She said, I have to go back and help protect my country. So that to me is such a sad distinction between those, such a warrior spirit, such a warrior heart, and those who we're reading about in this poll in America.
Well, we don't want to throw everybody under the bus. What you talk about, though, with the comfort, and you know what comes to mind when you say that? When you have land, you don't want people to, I'm thinking of the border. Yeah. I'm thinking of those ranchers that I've interviewed down there who are willing to fight for the land because the government won't help stave off the onslaught of millions of illegals coming across the border. And, you know, people are coming for all sorts of reasons, but they've had a crime burst down there too. It's very dangerous. You know, you've been.
Yes, I will say I think something bigger is at play here. I think America's critics have led a significant portion of this country to believe America's not worth fighting for, and that's why you see this most
that's
among
heartbreaking.
Millennials. The reason I say that is it is very audacious to admit to a pollster that you would not fight for this country, as 52% of Democrats did. And in the Wall Street Journal, you had Matthew Hennessy pointing this out. These 52%, he said, they had an option to lie. It would have cost them nothing to say, yeah, I'm a patriot, I'll stay and fight. That suggests they have antipathy toward the country, and that's right. We have a generation who is being told America's founding should be reoriented to 1619, that American exceptionalism is not real, that we're systemically racist, our justice system. These are the things that we're being told, where people, I feel, are ashamed to say I'm an American, and that's a really sad point in this country. I'm proud to be an American. Of course, we have sins in our history. This is a great country full of great patriots. So now we got to act like it and say we'll fight for the American ideal.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.